I'm going to be talking about ongoing work in our research lab that's focusing on traumatic stress populations and is examining alcohol use and post-traumatic stress syndromes, post-traumatic stress disorder, and their interplay in emerging adults and actually specifically in the VCU student population. So actually we'll be presenting some preliminary outcome data on a spin-off study from Spit for Science that was mentioned a little bit ago today. So looking forward to doing that. So traumatic events come in a number of different forms. So they range from motor vehicle accidents to natural disasters to sexual assault, physical assault, and a number of different things. They're also quite prevalent in the population and can occur over the course of the lifespan. And so on average, about 50 to 70% of individuals are likely to experience at least one traumatic event experience in their lifetime and potentially more. And our VCU students are certainly no exception to that. So to orient you, this is actually data taken from the Spit for Science longitudinal study, and really briefly to orient you to this, throughout the talk, our red is going to denote sex differences. So this is examining individuals and looking at prior history of sexual victimization or physical assault, which are the two most common traumatic events in this population. And we're capturing endorsements of sexual victimization or physical assault for students coming into VCU. Also capturing individuals who are reporting either one of these traumatic events over the course of their time at VCU. And the bottom panel is really looking at individuals who have a prior trauma history prior to VCU and then are experiencing additional traumatic events, so that re-victimization, which is a particularly vulnerable group. And so the main point that I want to make here is that we have a lot of trauma history coming in the door here. And also the fact that even though there's amazing programs in place, kind of prevention, and different systems in place at VCU, these traumatic events are still occurring. Now, for most individuals, or for a majority of individuals following a traumatic event, they are quite resilient or can recover naturalistically over time. But that's certainly not the case for everyone. And so two of the common negative outcomes following a traumatic event are post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol use disorder. So really briefly, just to kind of orient us to this. So PTSD, or post-traumatic stress, it's a negative outcome following a traumatic event, and it's a pretty heterogeneous symptom presentation. We look at symptoms in 4 different categories, so covering intrusions, avoidance, negative alterations in cognitions and mood, and alterations in physiological arousal. So examples would be negative thoughts, memories, nightmares, avoidance behavior of people, places, things, shame, guilt, and then startle response, difficulty sleeping, irritability, and the like. And then with alcohol use, again, we're getting beyond just typical high frequency and quantity, but really capturing that concept that individuals continuing to use despite negative outcomes to their health, to their mood, to their functioning with school, work, friends, and the like. Now, in addition to both of these being outcomes following a traumatic event, they very frequently co-occur. So in nearly half of individuals who are seeking treatment for an AUD diagnosis meet current criteria for PTSD. And this is 5 times the greater risk than the overall lifetime risk for post-traumatic stress disorder in the broad population. On the flip side, PTSD is associated with a nearly 4-fold increase of risk for AUD in young adults. So this comorbidity is particularly problematic. It's also problematic given that individuals who are comorbid for both tend to have greater symptom severity, they utilize treatment more frequently but don't respond as well, tend to have higher rates of relapse for alcohol use. So it's really an area that we're really trying to better understand so we can then work to improve our intervention and our prevention efforts for this. So there's a number of different models for comorbidity given how prevalent this is. The first one is really looking at kind of overall biological risk. And so, for example, genetic risk. So twin studies suggest that both AUD and PTSD are moderately heritable. There's also evidence for an overlap in that genetic risk, so some shared genes. So that's one kind of perspective to take. On the flip side, from the phenotypic side, there's a model that increased alcohol use can then lead to post-traumatic stress disorder in a couple of different ways. So one, that increased alcohol use increases your likelihood of being in potentially traumatic event environments. Also potentially can put you at more risk to have negative kind of stress responses following a traumatic event. The opposite direction of that is what we've heard a lot about today, is the drinking to cope model, also known as stress-related drinking, also known as the self-medication model. And I will say, it was a really interesting kind of process. I was kind of very torn in that. I got like, oh my gosh, I was searching for this online. I'm like, there's so many good examples of this, but also really bummed me out because it's really, really ubiquitous in our culture. So really getting at that stress-related drinking or drinking to cope self-medication model. And so I will mention that in and of itself, stress-related drinking, drinking to cope, is not in and of itself a problem. It's something that a lot of us do. We engage in it every now and then. And we can use it among a number of different coping strategies. But for some individuals, perhaps those that are at greater genetic risk or those that have a higher trauma history, that kind of can span and go on the other end of the spectrum where that becomes their go-to response. They continue to engage in that. They're experiencing a lot of symptoms and continue to drink. And that can then lead to problematic alcohol use and alcohol use disorder. I will mention that this kind of does map on with some of the epidemiological data in that age of onset for PTSD tends to be a bit earlier than age of onset for alcohol use disorder. And some longitudinal studies have shown this direction, but that is certainly not always the case, and is likely also bidirectional. I will also mention there's actually something that came up again earlier today when you think a bit about different copings for use. So the drinking to cope motive tends to be more strongly associated with alcohol use disorder as compared to enhancement motive. So I drink to feel good. Or the social motive, so I drink because other people are drinking. And so we do see that increased association between drinking to cope and these negative outcomes. The final thing that I want to mention here, though, is that a lot of the research that looks at drinking to cope being associated with post-traumatic stress disorder kind of captures this drinking to cope very broadly. It's kind of a broad kind of trait measure or kind of typical pattern of behavior. But there's really not been any work that's looking at drinking to cope for PTSD symptoms specifically to really help inform the literature on that co-occurrence between PTSD and alcohol use disorder. And that really brings me to the research that I'm going to be talking about today. So as I mentioned, this is a spin-off study that was conducted by a graduate student in our research lab that the overall goal was to examine the phenotypic and genetic relationship between alcohol use, so alcohol use disorder symptoms and trauma-related drinking, and PTSD and their overlap in a genetically informative study of college students. So there are a number of different aims of this study. Still, again, as I mentioned, pretty preliminary outcomes, but today I really want to focus on a couple of things in particular. So I want to focus on efforts to examine clinically relevant cutoffs for both post-traumatic stress symptoms and problematic alcohol use in this trauma-exposed college sample. And then I also want to start looking at trying to capture that relationship between alcohol use disorder symptoms, trauma-related drinking, and PTSD to really get a sense of whether that trauma-related drinking or drinking to cope really is helping to explain, in part, that common link that we tend to see. So to be enrolled in the follow-up study, individuals had to have endorsed at least some alcohol use and had to have reported at least one potentially traumatic event in the past. So currently, 1,700 individuals, basic demographics at the bottom, again, maps on very nicely to the broad VCU student population. So I want to spend a little bit of time walking through the measures here before I kind of jump into some of our preliminary results. So the TLEQ is a broad measure of trauma, and it captures endorsements of a wide range, 23 different trauma types, and so we get a sense of trauma type endorsement and overall frequency. The audit is a measure that gets at clinically relevant symptoms of alcohol use, so frequency, quantity, as well as associating with each of the diagnostic symptoms. And it has clinical cutoffs for certain levels of intervention. And I mention that because that will come back in a little bit later to help kind of inform clinical decision making. The PCL is a self-report measure of PTSD-related symptoms that map on to the symptoms that also has a clinical cutoff and results results in a total score as well as examination of the 4 different symptom clusters that I mentioned earlier. Now, the DMQ is the Drinking Motives Questionnaire, specifically capturing our coping-related motives. So I drink in order to feel less stress, in order to feel less sad, things like that. So we really wanted to then take our PTSD symptoms and the drinking to cope and try to kind of pull apart that relationship. And so this was a measure that was developed for the study that basically takes the drinking to cope questions and links them to each of the PTSD symptoms to really try and capture that specific trauma-related symptom, drinking to cope. So what does our sample look like? So I put this up for a number of different reasons. So again, here we see red is indicating sex differences. And so again, as maps onto the literature, we're seeing in individuals who have reported at least one traumatic event, the average is multiple, maps onto what we tend to see. I will mention, though, that generally speaking in the literature, males tend to actually have higher rates of traumatic events than females. And so it's interesting, it could certainly be specifically to the sample, but I also wondered that perhaps at an earlier age, we do see a higher rate in females, and that over the course of the lifetime, that tends to shift. The sex differences map on for the audit and the PCL that we tend to see higher rates in males in drinking, higher rates in females in PTSD symptoms. We did not see, however, differences in drinking to cope more broadly, as well as trauma-related drinking to cope. The other thing that I want to point out here is that, broadly speaking, the averages, kind of the mean scores, are pretty low. Well, this is certainly a good thing, something that we would want. And so for the audit, it's below the general clinical cutoff where we start to want to monitor and intervene. PCL is also below the clinical cutoff, but they're certainly not 0. And then both the drinking to cope and trauma-related drinking are also pretty low. And so I say this for a couple of different reasons. From a research perspective, so that we're looking at this pattern broadly speaking, but I think it might also be then useful in future analyses to pull out those who are endorsing higher levels of trauma-related drinking or who are endorsing higher levels of PTSD and really examine those in a bit more detail to really unpack this question. But I also think this might be important too because we're clearly getting at individuals who are experiencing symptoms, who are engaging in some trauma-related drinking, but they may not yet be at the level of diagnosable conditions. And so that might be a really, really important time to consider intervening. So now getting to the question of how do these things kind of interact. So one of the things that I was particularly interested in was whether individuals are kind of hitting that kind of criteria for clinically relevant post-traumatic stress symptoms. Are they more likely to be engaging in problematic alcohol use in the sample? So as I mentioned before, there's a clinical cutoff in the PCL. So above that number is considered a positive screen. And we see this kind of dose-dependent association where for individuals who did screen positive on the left, across the board, they were more likely to engage in those problematic levels of drinking. And so the red here is that this pattern was actually greater in males for the suggested kind of brief counseling and monitoring. And to me, I think what's also really relevant is that while the percentages overall are low for individuals in the problematic drinking level, this is a really high level of problematic drinking. And it's really going to be individuals that we absolutely want to follow up with and consider kind of doing interventions on. So for me, this also then kind of points to that link between when one is present, the other may also be present too, even if it's not something that a student is coming in the door for, or even aware is associated and linked to me that triggers the importance of examining the other if one is present. So now just jumping to just basic correlations, really trying to get a sense of early patterns of what we're finding. So a couple things I want to point out here. The first is this kind of moderate, so strong correlation between drinking to cope motives and trauma-related drinking. And this is one of those things that we got really excited about, this like simple little number. But to me, it was really interesting because they're highly associated, but they're not one and the same. And so to me, this gets at the fact that drinking to cope may be a broader kind of pattern. And then within that are going to be individuals who are going to be drinking to cope more specifically with their trauma-related symptoms. Then the other thing that I want to point out is this. You can see this pattern of correlations looking at the association with our PTSD symptom total score and then all the different symptom clusters, that they're most strongly associated with our trauma-related drinking. moderately associated with our drinking to cope more broadly, and then only slightly associated with the audit score. And I think that's important because people drink for a number of different reasons, and they drink problematically for a number of different reasons. And so we really want to be capturing more of that subset, so that subset of individuals who are drinking to cope broadly, and then really getting at the drinking to deal with their PTSD symptoms. So just really quickly to go over this one, I was also interested in the fact that, what if certain symptoms are driving this association? So as I mentioned, PTSD is a very heterogeneous symptom presentation, and you can have two individuals who are meeting criteria or subthreshold criteria who can look very different depending on the pattern of symptoms. So I was curious if you could include all of them on here. There are certain ones that seem to be really relevant. And again, at the top here, we're seeing not much all that interesting, which certainly isn't surprising given that we're not having that direct link. But then when we really look at PTSD symptoms linking trauma-related drinking, all of these other symptoms, except for avoidance, were associated. So they're all quite relevant. And I also mention this because this was one of those things that went against what I had expected. So clinically speaking, I always tended to consider alcohol use or substance use in PTSD to be an avoidance behavior. Certainly not saying that it is not, but what it might actually be, and what I'm really hoping to look into a bit more, is that perhaps it's avoidance of these specific symptoms and kind of working through those specific symptoms. So the last little bit of data that I want to kind of talk through, and again, early kind of investigations, but to really get at our question, we're really asking, is the association that we see in the literature between PTSD symptoms and our alcohol use, is that really happening because of trauma-related drinking? Now, ideally, we have longitudinal data for this. We did not. We did the best that we can. What I will mention is that there's that lack of association between PTSD symptoms and audit score overall. But we are seeing an indirect effect that accounts for about 24% of the audit score working through trauma-related drinking. And so to me, it's getting at that concept that, again, people are drinking for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are related to trauma, and measuring that trauma-related drinking is attempting to get at that process a little bit. I'll also briefly mention that I quickly looked at risky drinking versus not in the PTSD symptom clusters, and we see that direct association between arousal and an indirect effect between negative cognitions and the intrusion symptoms as well. All right, so my final takeaway. So I tend to think of this literature as kind of from both a clinical perspective and a research perspective, and certainly they interplay, overlap, whatever you want to do. But just a couple of really important takeaways that I want to kind of convey here. So the first one being how important it is to be mindful of trauma. It is prevalent. It is relevant for our students that are coming in, even if it may have happened quite a long time. Potentially useful to inquire about because it may be associated with some of the symptom presentations that we're seeing. Trauma-related drinking is particularly linked to PTSD symptom presentation. And so in some ways attempting to get at the reasons for the drinking behavior. Now, some people are pretty aware of their reasons. Not everybody is, so it's certainly not going to be as easy as kind of asking that question, but to be mindful of that and try to examine some of the reasons for drinking. We also notice different presentations by sex. And that also, to me, links up to this kind of presence of one, maybe indicative of the other. So you may have an individual coming in, so maybe a male coming in with alcohol use problems. It might be important to inquire into trauma history and potentially relevant symptoms. And vice versa. You may have an individual coming in with certain post-traumatic stress symptoms. It's not even aware that their drinking is necessarily problematic, but it could be increasing the severity of that. And then finally, the relevance of brief screens. So all of these measures are certainly not very long, also not necessarily realistic to give to everybody, but pulling out important interview or assessment questions can hopefully trigger the need for further assessment for individuals who may be more at risk. As far as the research takeaways go, this is one way we hope to understand some of that comorbidity. There's also a difference between overall drinking to cope versus trauma-related drinking to cope. And I think future work trying to understand this comorbidity would really benefit from focusing some of that work onto trauma-specific and trauma-related symptoms in regards to drinking. Longitudinal analyses are certainly needed to get a sense of pattern and the bidirectionality. And then finally, other factors to consider. So these are, again, pretty basic analyses on, on this association, but we know that other symptoms are relevant. So depression is a common outcome following trauma, also commonly associated with both of these outcomes. That's going to be important. Trauma timing and type, so how recent that happened, how many traumatic experiences, are they currently in a dangerous environment or currently in an interpersonal violence situation, things like that are all going to have different effects on these outcomes. And then finally, looking at environmental factors, so negative ones being risky drinking in peers, or positive ones being really useful social supports as well. So I will leave it that with our kind of both clinical and research takeaways. A big thank you to all of those involved and for letting me present on some of the early findings. I'm really looking forward to further analyses with some of this data and hopefully get at some really interesting findings and answer some good questions. So thank you.